Hey there. So hopefully you can see my slide and hear me. That's good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this. As Ben said, I write about protest. And I suppose one of the kind of immediate things about protest is how immediate it is. So if you think of protests that you may have been on, or protests that you've seen on the telly or seen walking past on the street, one of the things you often hear is, what do we want X? When do we want it now? So there's this sense of immediacy and nowness about protest, which is kind of reproduced in the academic disciplines that study it in different ways. So if we look at things like the field of social movement studies, that tends to really focus on the kind of moments when movements become visible in public space in like really highly mediated protest events. And though there is a sense of looking at movements in terms of waves or cycles or peaks, we put a lot more energy into focusing on that peak visible moment and much less on that kind of more boring everyday trough. We tend to kind of, that drops out of our sight in lots of different ways. Similarly, media and communication studies, again, it focuses on the highly mediated kind of there, now, spontaneous, immediate moments in that way. And it tends to be quite siloed. Again, there's a push in media and communications to go beyond looking at things through a particular media form as the lens for understanding those dynamics, but we still shrink back into thinking, okay, what has digital movements done, or what has the radio done, or what has television done, rather than looking across those different moments. So as I've kind of studied this area more, and as I get older, I think, I become more and more interested in thinking about protest in the long view, not just the now, but the kind of longer evolution of protest as it unfolds over time. And so this is kind of where this project has sprung from. And I've kind of turned more and more to looking at memory studies as a way of kind of pulling out these dynamics, and kind of Hubble-Watch's notion of collective memory is really helpful here. So I've just got a quote, which I'm going to read aloud. What makes recent memories hang together is not that they are contiguous in time. It is rather that they are part of a totality of thought common to a group, the groups of people with whom we have a relation at this moment, or with whom we have had a relation on the preceding day or days. And again, we have this kind of slightly fractured understanding of how time is playing out here. So we have communities of memory, but who they have a relationship with in this moment, or the preceding days, or at most days. And there's work, again, in media and communications, which looks at how that relationship, that hanging together, can be pulled out using media. So how we can extend that kind of that time frame of memory, and also the spaces, the communities that come together to share collective memory in that way. And this work particularly focuses on the digital. But I have been really interested in thinking about this in terms of the analog as well, not just in terms of the digital, and kind of pulling away a bit from the digital. So the work that I'm going to talk about today brings together these three different academic fields, and it's underpinned by work I've done with the Mass Observation Archive, looking particularly at three different directives. So one around the Iraq War, which had a question specifically around the anti-war demonstrations that took place then. One that I put together around protest and memory, which asked about memory more generally, and one around Black Lives Matter following the death of George Floyd in 2020. And so we kind of have this, or I have spoken before in my other work, about how protest kind of brings together people from the margins who feel themselves or perceive themselves to be excluded, and people kind of come together and occupy mainstream public spaces as a way of articulating their dissent to whatever is happening. And if we look at this through the lens of memory, we can kind of see what Whedon and Jordan would describe as counter memory. So the sense that you have memory which is challenging kind of officially sanctioned memory in different ways. And Hubble-Watch allows for kind of different types of memory. He doesn't claim there's kind of universal memory. He sees a plurality of memories there. But I think other people have pointed out that it's as if conflict or tension or dissent doesn't exist. These memories all just kind of hang together nicely. And I think that if we don't question that, if we don't trouble that, we lose something quite important, specifically, particularly when we come to thinking about protest, which is all about dissent, it's all about tension, it's all about conflict in so many different ways. And so I suppose what I've been wanting to try and do with this work is to take what is a kind of growing kind of push towards thinking not just about collective memory, but counter memories, so the tensions between the mainstream and the margins, but pull that out even further and look at tensions or conflicts within counter memory. So rather than seeing counter memory as a kind of homogenized or uniform block, pulling it out and looking at those nuances and the tensions and the kind of differences there. And for me, I found that part of that has been moving away from looking solely at activist accounts. So lots and lots of the work in this area is really privileges activist narratives, and there are really good reasons for that. Activists are agents, they tend to produce media, they're producing social and political change in that way, and as people like Fraser points out, they have a kind of direct and disproportional impact on democracy. So those are really, really valuable accounts, and we need to kind of know about that. They're also relatively easy to access as subjects. Activists have put a lot of time and energy into campaigns over their life, and they're very frequently keen to talk about it in interviews. It's often much harder to talk to people who have a passing interest in protests. It's harder to access them. People often feel that there's nothing valuable in what they're saying and that it's not really that important. And so I found the Mass Observation Archive a brilliant way of accessing those stories that are frequently not told. They're harder to find, and people are often less willing to place value on those memories. Whereas, as Sam was saying in the previous talk, with the Mass Observation Archive, you get this brilliant reflective quality where people don't just go, oh, I don't remember anything about protest, but go, oh, actually, thinking about it a bit more, I do remember about protest. Or particularly in terms of remembering and forgetting, we kind of forget first and then afterwards we must remember. And that's a kind of two-step process. So the Mass Observation Archive really pulled out those things that people had thought they had forgotten in different ways, and were just, you know, an invaluable resource. So before going on to talk about people's memories, I want to make a really quick aside on forgetting, because I went in to read all of my lovely responses thinking, oh, I'm going to hear about all of these different political protests. And actually it became really quickly that politics was the thing that everybody forgot, most of all. So there was this sense whereby people remembered what I think of as like now the top hits of protests. So you could kind of go Suez, Aldermaston, Vietnam, Greenham, the miners' strike, the poll tax riots, Iraq, Trump, Brexit. And people frequently reference these kind of big demonstrations as a kind of access point to talk about their memories more widely. But beyond that, everything kind of blurred one protest into another protest. This was really, really true for kind of onlookers or occasional protesters who often had no memory at all of what the kind of impetus for their protest was. But even quite committed activists who had engaged in a great deal of protest, their memories, they merged one protest into another protest. So they'd say, oh, it was in the anti-war demonstrations, but maybe it wasn't, maybe it was anti-austerity. So this kind of merging together of memories in different ways. The other thing which I found quite quickly was that, and again, this kind of picks up things that Sam was saying about respondents' willingness to categorize things. So I didn't ask respondents to identify themselves as an activist or a protester or an onlooker, but respondents were really keen to position themselves explicitly or contextually as either an activist or a protester or an onlooker. And even when they describe themselves as one thing now, an activist, they would reflect back and go, back then I wasn't an activist, back then I was a protester. So it wasn't a fixed position. They moved between these different positions at different points in the narratives that they were giving. Oh, I forgot to click my pictures there to demonstrate activist, protester and onlooker. So you had quotes like this. I hope you could see that. I hope that the little pictures of people aren't going over it. They might be. Oh, and now I've skipped ahead. Okay, so you had people saying things like, the kinds of protests I've included in this response were all organised by bigger organisations. I was very much a member of the public, just so showing support. So there were loads of times where people position themselves with this use of modifiers. I was just doing this, I was only doing that, I wasn't really doing this. So this sense of kind of almost minimizing their political engagement, their political participation. And this extended to people putting themselves in passive sentence constructions. So downplaying their involvement in many ways, partly because they wished, it seemed, to give credit to the work of activists. So you had the second quote, at Greenham I saw the women who camped there as the dedicated others. They were aside, I thought, from those who came in on buses for the day. I guess I revered them. So you had this kind of distinction constantly being created and maintained in different ways. And you had it maintained the other way as well. So from activists who recognised the activist self, but also activist others. So here would be a quote, I mean, I describe them as activists. I would always see them at a demo, but I probably wouldn't personally know them. But it's just funny. You always see these faces and you always look at each other like, oh, I know you, but I don't really know you. So this was the dynamic that people took up and constructed in different ways, kind of in ways that recalled to me Susan Gell's work on kind of fractals. So they would be picked up and that kind of binary between the protester and the activist, or the onlooker and the protester, would be replayed in different ways, so that the categories change, but the hierarchical relationship between the two of them stayed the same. So having looked at that, I'm going to just spend the next bit of the presentation looking at each group in turn. So activists, I'm sorry. So there was the responses from people who talked about themselves as activists, kind of indicated that there was a real shared collective understanding of the labour of activism. So one respondent described it as the business of it. And they kind of, lots of people listed the work that they did. So dishing out information, writing letters, speaking at public meetings, organising meetings, presenting petitions. So this is the labour that goes on in the troughs that we see much less often in media and communication studies, definitely, but also quite a lot in social movement studies work as well. But this sense that beneath all of these kind of really, really different, varied types of work, there was this sense that there was this push, this central push to improving things that really needed improving, as that second quote said. And with that came this sense of kind of conviviality, this sense of comradeship, that emerged through shared labour, through working together on a kind of shared endeavour. And this ties in with the work around kind of distraction in the public sphere. So that sense that if people are going to participate in an active and ongoing way in the public sphere, there needs to be a pleasure there. There needs to be a kind of satisfaction in it. And lots of the activists talked about that. So this first person said, maybe it's just me. I like being the organiser. I like shaping it. And then coupled in with that, and often tied in with the kind of comradeship that people spoke about, was the way in which this sociability made individuals more prepared to undertake riskier actions. So this sense that being part of a group, being part of a collective, people were more prepared to take risks in public space in different ways. And that this was something that lots of activists saw as a kind of defining feature of activism, a kind of preparedness to step up and out individually in different ways. So that's kind of thinking about activists. In terms of thinking about protesters, I kind of come back to this point that I've already made in some ways, whereby the politics is what was forgotten. And what was remembered by either one-off protesters or serial protesters was the kind of cultural practices associated with protest rather than the politics of it. So people had very little to say about the politics and instead told me about the weather, which might have been glorious or might have been miserable, or the parking, or how difficult it is to find loos, or the picnic that they took, or the friends that they went with. These were the elements that seemed to persist over time. And so there was this sense of that peak being as much about a kind of set of cultural practices and engagements with others as it was around politics. People seemed to see themselves not as comrades, as activists often describe themselves, but as one protester put it, as a kind of part of a temporary community of like-minded strangers. So the sense of being with people who were like you, but not quite you. And the thing that really, really struck me was the keenness with which people wanted to be identified with this position of protester, not activist. And it's something that I don't see enormously in other work in the field. So the sense that it wasn't just a question of downplaying their contribution in order to recognise the contribution of those who were kind of more overtly activist in their approaches, but the sense that it was from their ordinariness that their moral authority came from. So here, ordinariness is a really powerful position. It's a powerful place to challenge authority, to assert rights, and to make demands in different ways. And the ordinariness, this kind of thing of being mass, or swelling the numbers, or being inexperienced reinforcements, this kind of sense of being ordinary, of being individual, also ties into a sense that being in the mass was a protection, because running through a lot of the responses as well was kind of the fear of protest, the fear of potentially violent encounters during the protest in different ways. So there was this sense that to be anonymous gave you kind of the protection of numbers. So the sense that ordinary protesters were anonymous, but like loudly anonymous. They were loudly claiming that ordinary people position in different ways, and that this ameliorated the perceived risks of protest, which activists were much more keen to take on. So what we end up with in different ways is this sense that ordinary people, protesters, kind of shared a broad understanding of their role in protest, shared an understanding with Habermas's idea of the public sphere in different ways. So this idea that individuals come together in a public space in order to arrive at some sort of consensus over what constitutes the public good. So people talked a lot about themselves being a universal articulation of citizenship that was trying to hold the government to account in different ways. So that sense of taking action to heighten awareness and put pressure on decision makers when all democratic avenues have been ineffective. I think the more surprising thing for me was the way in which protesters, when they gave account of their protest memory, were not terribly focused, it wasn't that they weren't focused on the success of the protest, but they took a long view of what success meant, and that their participation in protest wasn't predicated on the successful outcome of the protest. So this second quote here: "I cannot regret being there. Being there meant I was being counted, even if it didn't result in the savings of students' grants." So there was the sense that the act of protesting was seen as valuable in a way that wasn't related to the successful outcome of the protests that they were participating in. And that when they did look at success, or not success, failure, it didn't kind of depress people. It didn't seem to make people feel dismal or hopeless or pessimistic. So we have this quote here: "A month later, the war started right on schedule. So we didn't stop this war, but I think we might have stopped the next one." So this sense that participants in mass demonstrations really saw their participation in the long term and in ways which can't be quantified as either successful or not successful, because we can't see whether the next war was stopped or not stopped because of the demonstration. So there was this sense whereby for many ordinary people protesting, it was seen as part of a kind of ongoing participation in the democratic process, as well as, and perhaps sometimes as importantly, as a intervention in a particular set of debates or prospective legislation or whatever was going on at that moment. So they talked, or for example, one respondent talked about how they saw themselves as a persistent undercurrent of pressure, that it was extending out beyond the peaks of protest and connecting them all up. I'm not quite sure how I'm doing for time. I think I'm okay. So the last category I looked at was what I've called onlookers, and I borrow that term from Kant. It's always a good person to borrow things from. He talks about onlookers in the French Revolution who looked on as the French Revolution took place with enthusiasm, and he talks about the value of this. So there were lots of people who kind of, I've taken this quote at the top, I didn't go on the march, but I do remember. So this sense that people didn't need to be participating in protest to have a memory of protest in different ways. And onlookers, there was a kind of a real range of different positions, from people who were very uninterested in protest. So I love this quote, I preferred to live my life without worrying what was going on in the wider world. And that is how I've always lived. So I found it really, really interesting. This was a tiny response. It was very small. It didn't go on to expand hugely on this kind of position. But I thought how interesting that they've taken the trouble to respond, even if their response is to say that I'm not really interested. So I kind of see it as, it's not a passive rejection, it's quite an active kind of refusal to engage in that conversation in that way. And that kind of unpicks the view of the onlooker as being passive, because here onlooking has taken effort, it's taken thought and time and finding a stamp and all of those other things in order to say that one is not interested in it. There was another large group of people who watched protest but disapproved of protest in different ways. So this middle quote exemplifies that. So I've watched the TV coverage of these events, but these determined me more than ever not to get involved, as they seem to be led by professional rabble-rousers intent on stirring up trouble. So again, this sense of being an onlooker but still having a view. An onlooker isn't equated with being viewless or being passive in that way. And then you had a third category of onlookers who saw themselves as participating at a distance with protests taking place in the street. And this particularly came out very richly where people talked about marching through the streets and knowing their parents were watching on television, or parents watching the television knowing that their parents were their children were at a protest. So this sense that people who may not have directly experienced the protest but had a vicarious memory of the protests were connected up in different ways. So that sense of enthusiasm and that sense of lending those on the streets moral authority. The thing that came out most out of this category of respondents, which I found really, really interesting, was the kind of sense of mournful regret in lots and lots of the responses. So really a really high number, a much higher number than I could ever have anticipated, spoke regretfully of not having participated in protest in different times. Particularly those who identified not feeling brave enough or being wimpy as the barrier to participation in protest about issues that they had really, really strong feelings about. So one woman, and I think I've got her quote here, said, "I regret that I have not taken part in protest marches or vigils because I feel strongly about the futility of war and the wickedness of the arms trade." So again, this sense that not participation doesn't equate with not being interested, and this sense of fear, the fear of protest, the fear of imagined violence in a protest. So whereas activists kind of had the sense of camaraderie that enabled them to be prepared to take risks, whereas protesters saw anonymity and a kind of position of being an ordinary person as a protection in many ways from the perceived danger of violence, many onlookers gave an account which foregrounded their fear of violence in protests as a reason for not going. And at the same time as that, they also had a kind of imagined future, or sometimes even an imagined past, where they would have participated. So one respondent said, "I used to wonder what it would be like to actually go on a march or protest, to really believe in what they were doing was right, and hopefully wake up the ruling classes to do something about it." So through these responses, there comes a kind of almost heroic image of the protester as kind of going out there in different ways. And this can be summed up in the respondent who said, "I like to think that if I were taken up in an actual protest, that I would be bold, but I would not transgress the law. I would, however, defend myself and those within my charge from any assault from whoever it came." So this sense that many of these onlookers saw themselves almost as protesters in waiting for the moment where they would feel able to participate in different ways. So to wrap up, what I've tried to do in this research, and what the Mass Observation Archive has really, really enabled me to do, is to move away from thinking about protest as kind of more homogenized units of experience, and to focus on the way in which memory connects up these kind of peaks and troughs of protest experience in different ways, and runs across lots of different media forms. In doing this, I've kind of moved away from the focus which has characterized my previous work and is really valuable in lots of different ways, which focuses very much on the experiences and memories of activists. And it's moved towards trying to engage with the experience and memories of ordinary people in different ways. There's work that kind of does this in an online sense, if we look at the work around Black Lives Matter or Me Too, but there's less work that looks at this in kind of more analog contexts. And so by doing this, I hope to kind of pull out those nuances and the kind of contradictions and the tensions in the memory of ordinary people, protesters, onlookers, and to so expand the understanding of how protest functions in the public sphere. And I think that's my 20 minutes.